Good Monday morning. We have a lot of work to do today, and I remind you that you can go back to the sermon, which is part 9, and get a much fuller explanation. But we have a new word to explain to you today. But first of all, we're going to read the problematic passage, 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 34 and 35. Women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church. The word church here is ekklesia, a gathering of the community that was very, very common in Greek society. Remember, Greek at that time meant Western society. Every secular community decision was made by a calling out of the leaders of the community in a public setting to speak and to work this out. And that public setting of the gathering was ekklesia. Far too often we use the word church, which we translate this to be church, to mean a building of a particular faith tradition. That is not what this is. This is a gathering. In fact, the riot that drove Paul out of Ephesus, that gathering of the riot was called an ekklesia. So it is a gathering of the community to deal with an issue. At those gatherings, women were not permitted to speak by the Greek authorities. By custom, local authorities, it was done sometimes by law, but mainly by peer pressure and disapproval. Disapproval is a very powerful thing. We have writings from Plutarch, Aristophanes, Sophocles, Democritus, Aelius Ariastes, other writings of the time speaking of women and saying that silence was the glory of women, and that speaking authoritatively in public was improper of women. Paul challenges these conventions in Galatians chapter 3:28, as well as in 1 Corinthians 11, but not here in 1 Corinthians 14. Should look and see a rock in the river here. There's a challenge in reconciling this passage, frankly, with Paul's approval of women praying and prophesying in the church in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. He approved of them having a hymn, a word of knowledge, a word of instruction, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation in chapter 14, verse 26. However, why would he change all of that a few verses later? Scholars try to square this circle, and they've got 4 different ways, just very briefly here. Paul required silence of all the women in all the assemblies of the church, or Paul required women to be silent in some qualified sense, or these verses cite a false prophecy that Paul was naming and then correcting, or 4, these verses are, here's your new word, an interpolation. Interpolation means an insertion of words into the text that were not in the original document. Most of the time, this is not done nefariously. What happened was people would write the text out, and then a scribe would go back and check to make sure they got it right. If there was anything missing or needed correcting, they would put that into the margins, so that the next time that document is copied, that correction could be worked into the text. Other times, they would write a comment off to the side. Generally speaking, these interpolations are very minor. For example, the word behold, how wonderful, and that works its way into the text. Others are more problematic, like 1 John chapter 5 and verse 7, which is used often as a proof of the Trinity. By the way, for the record, I believe in the Trinity. But 1 John 5:7 was certainly not in the earliest manuscripts we have of 1 John. There was almost certainly a comment made or a study note made in the margin that someone mistook the next copiers as part of the text that should have been included and stuck it in there. What about the first view? That Paul is absolutely requiring the silence of women, all women in all assemblies everywhere. That jars against 1 Corinthians 11, Galatians 3, chapter 14 earlier. It just seems to be completely against what Paul has been saying. Remember that Luke, Paul's companion, records Acts chapter 2, where Peter quotes Joel and twice says that women are also in this new body prophesying and teaching. What about the second idea that Paul required women to be quiet in some qualified sense? The problem is nobody can tell you what the qualified sense is. Some have said, well, only false teachers couldn't speak out. Well, when are false teachers allowed to speak, male or female? It would seem odd just to pick on the women false teachers. Others say that women were being disruptive and asking too many questions, but verses 34 and 35 doesn't just limit questions. So that doesn't seem to fit either. So I'd have to reject both of those. The third is that Paul is citing a false prophecy and then he's going to correct it. There are a couple problems with this. First of all, the book of 1 Corinthians in particular does have a lot of you say this and I say this, for example, and sometimes people misquote it. Sometimes people will say, Paul says it's good for a man not to touch a woman. No, he didn't. He said, now concerning some of which some of you have said, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, but I say, let each husband have his wife and each wife have her husband. There's a lot of that in 1 Corinthians, but that doesn't fit here. That doesn't fit the pattern. In fact, it even interrupts the flow. Try to read this chapter without those two verses in it. Flows. Makes sense. Every point leads to the next one. Put those verses in, it doesn't. And this is where interpolation comes in. As I said, if they made any errors, they would put it off to the side. Now, they did not divide into verses, but the length of these words, the number of these words, if placed in a margin, would cover everything from verse 33 down to verse 40. Interestingly enough, our Western manuscripts have these two verses after verse 40. But all other manuscripts that have it after verse 33. That's a huge and very powerful argument that this worked its way in from the margin. And that one tradition was to put it early, the other tradition was to put it at the end. Gordon Fee, who's not known as a liberal, and the great bulk of scholars that have looked at this agree that the evidence is overwhelming, that this is an interpolation, not the words of Paul, not inspired, but added by a later writer whose text was then copied and assumed it belonged into the main body of the text. That would explain why it contradicts Paul in 1 Corinthians 11:14 and Galatians 3. We can even date this, by the way. We can date the first manuscripts that have these two verses in there as the latter part of the 2nd century AD. When copyists did their work, they'd go back and check. Eventually, sometimes this moves over. In a good study Bible, there will be a note to that effect, or the entire passage will be italics. For example, the study of the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8 is almost in all Bibles put in italics, set a little bit separate, and a little note to the bottom, this is not in the earliest text. The same with 1 John 5:7 and a host of others. This is by far, in my opinion, the most damaging interpolation. And it is almost never set apart. And yet, it's not in our earliest. This is a text problem that is known. One of our earliest copies of Scripture is the Codex Vaticanus. The Vatican owns it. It is marked, these two verses, as a textual variant. There's a horizontal bar with two dots. It's called a sigla to indicate this is a questionable passage. It's a textual variant. The other manuscripts we have doesn't have this. Why were these issues like this? I'm trying to keep this within a Monday morning message length. Issues like this were very well known in the ancient world. Origen once, more than once, expressed his belief that the Septuagint, which is Paul's favorite version, he quoted from it more than any other, that the Septuagint was corrupt. He wasn't alone in that. The earliest surviving text we have those sigla, the bars and the dots, indicating variants. In 541, that's pretty early, Saint Victor, Bishop of Padua, sometimes I believe known as Colonna, ordered the text of 1 Corinthians 14 rewritten with those verses left out because he said all of the manuscripts he had seen, those verses weren't in there. Therefore, they are additions to the text. I know this sounds sloppy, and for those who want to hold to the traditional view of silencing women, they're going to go, well, isn't that convenient? Well, the fact is that sometimes facts aren't convenient. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they help bolster your argument, and sometimes they kill it. This is a fact. Clement of Alexandria, for example, who has no particular high view of women, except for next week you'll find one that he did, commented and preached on every verse in 1 Corinthians 14, except 34 and 35, which he would have latched onto because he had a very low view of women. The apostolic fathers quote 1 Corinthians more than any other epistle. There are a lot of apostolic fathers. I'm not going to name them all. We have limited time. But I will say this, not one refer to or quote verses 34 and 35 of chapter 14. Not one. Why? It indicates through our earliest manuscripts, it wasn't there. The first of the ancient fathers to mention a passage is our old buddy Tertullian, who had some nasty things to say about women, if you remember. And he mentioned it around 200 AD. By then, at least one manuscript had it in the text. We could go on for hours, but let's wrap this up. These verses contradict Paul's earlier teaching. They interrupt the flow of Paul's argument. They don't fit with the flow of the chapter. They also say, just as the law says, a phrase Paul never uses anywhere else, and there is no Old Testament law he could be referring to. It could be that it's referring to some secular local law about speaking of women in a public assembly, but we don't have a record of that law. We don't know what in the world that phrase is referring to. It also goes against the fact that Paul always lifts up downtrodden groups. He always lifts them up. Here he would be creating a new, lesser subgroup. And it also seems to be completely unknown to the manuscripts and the church fathers, the apostolic fathers, and church leaders of the church's first 150 years. Now, knowing this, and knowing it's happened elsewhere, should that make you lose confidence in the fact that we have the scripture that was written back? No. You should take comfort in the fact that the community continually examines its text and makes corrections as the facts require. It's rather like science. Should we not trust science because we used to take a polio vaccine for life? Now we know that that wears off after a certain amount of time, so we need to do something else. Therefore, we give up on science, period. No. The value of science is that it continually corrects itself. It is weighed down and slowed down by governments and by government grants and by corporate grants. There's no question. If I'm a guy paying your salary and I'm giving you $1 million for you and your lab a year, and I want this result, that messes with science. But you understand, pure science always corrects, always changes its mind. It's never settled. And the same with our text. If we find an earlier manuscript that has this in there, we're going to change our mind. But we don't have that. Therefore, we make a correction. Well, why then do we still have this passage and it's not italicized? That's an uglier story. We're going to talk about that next week by using the example of one woman who was erased, or they tried to. More about that next week. Thank you for riding this ride with us. I hope that it has piqued your interest, that it's made you think a bit. And if it's helped you change your mind, great. But if it didn't, that's okay too, because we're saved by Jesus and our faith in him. Thank you. Thank you for supporting us, for loving us, for keeping us alive and keeping this channel going. God bless you. We'll talk next time.